Hi everybody, welcome to another episode of Historia Politica Pública. In the episode of today, I will keep talking about the book of Appiah, Lies That Bind. This is the second part about the series about the idea of culture, identity, how the society has shaped our own identities, and these labels that we cannot pick just for ourselves, but is a kind of concept of society. But henceforth, it have a great importance in the way that we behave with our surroundings. In the last episode, I analyzed the first chapter of the book of Appiah, which is classification, how the idea of identity was being built in after 1950s during the post-war period, how this kind of idea coincide with the social movement one decade later, in which there was the wave of feminism, LGBTQ plus movement, civil rights movements in America, or the students' revolts in all the world. And here I will finish to analyze this chapter, classification, and also two other chapters of the book, which are creed and country. The book, as I mentioned in the last episode, is divided in 6 episodes, and they cover huge amount of aspects that are resonate widely in our current society. As I mentioned in the other episode, Kwame Anthony Appiah. He's a British person who has a father from Ghana, and this was very important in his upbringing. He always told the anecdote how when he was in New York, a taxi driver asked him where was he from, and he replied that he's from London. However, because he's black, the taxi driver reply him again, but where are you originally from? And Appiah conclude that what the taxi driver wanted to know, it is where that black face came from. So he's great analyzing the idea of identities, labels, and so on, how a person can feel different things, and at the end it will be society which will impose upon this person the identity of him or her. So, going back to the episode of classification by Appiah, he points an important difference between sex and gender, something that emerged in the 1960s during the wave of feminism. How sex is a biological situation, whereas gender is a whole set of ideas about what women and men will be like and about how they should behave. Obviously, this has drink a lot about the philosophy by Simone de Beauvoir, and her book The Second Sex, in which she said that one is not born a woman, one becomes a woman. How society shape our perception, reality. I explained in the last episode many examples about that idea, so I won't take a long time with this and we'll go further, but it's an important distinction that is resonates a lot nowadays with the different also we have transgender people and how they are they want to consider them they are free people, and in order to do so they believe that they have the right to choose their own sex. And in that sense, this is an interesting debate that is happening nowadays. There is a lot of backlash. For my own position, I believe that every person should be free for do whatever they want, as long as they do not curtail the freedom of others. And for my understanding, they want to change their sex and so on, they are free to do so. So in that sense, Appiah takes the idea of intersectionality, how the different groups can coalesce together in order to change society, how he expressed that an identity cannot be imposed upon me, but neither I can shape that identity as I please, and that identity form the ideas of the person. This is one of the most important, I think, teachings of Appiah, how even though a person wants to point to you and call you in a different way, this is not your identity, but at the same time you cannot define which is your identity. So it is a kind of combination between the social conditioning of your surroundings, the way that you have been born, the family environment, the school that you were living into, the kind of country. Like if you are living in a Muslim society or a Christian society or a Buddhist society, probably your perception of the world outside yourself will be different. And in that sense, there is an interesting concept that he explains, which is the habitus. Habitus is the part of social and psychological significance of identities, and he defines the habitus as, quote, a set of dispositions to respond more or less spontaneously to the world in particular ways, end quote. This is very important, and this is how ideology functions better. Slavoj Žižek has analyzed this widely, how he explains that capitalism is the most important ideology, the ideology who has permeated more in society, because precisely it seems that capitalism is not an ideology, and precisely because it takes away this level as an ideology, as consider itself as something neutral and so on. It is for that reason that people have been more able to embrace this idea, whether you think maybe on a kind of religion like Christianity or Hinduism and so on. You may believe that those religions are dogmatic, and henceforth you refuse them according to our current values, at least in many societies in the Western world. However, capitalism is a secular religion that it does not announce itself as so, and yet it is based on some dogmas like the market it will work if it's left to itself and so on. Ideas that has been proved false, as was seen in the 1929 the economic crisis in the United States, or in the economic crash 2007-2008 in Europe, or the current economic crisis in which the rich people are getting richer and the poor are getting poor. And this has been recently reported by the Oxfam analysis, which it has shown how the 1% had become richer during the pandemic, where the rest of the people have lost part of their resources. So, this habitus that Appiah mentioned, it was first analyzed by Pierre Bourdieu, which is grounded, according to the French political theories, in bodily hexes, a kind of a durable way of standing, speaking, walking, and thereby feeling and thinking. This is related with the idea of Appiah about when you change your accent, when you go to another country and you want to feel integrated within society. You don't want to sound maybe too foreigner, so sometimes you're trying to adapt your accent to the new language, using the kind of intonation, the tune of voice that they are using there. So for instance, if I am from Spain and go to UK, I've been living there for almost 9 years, and I was trying to kind of relate my accent to the British people there, in order to be understood, that also as an indirect manner, a subtle way to feel integrated, even though you don't realize that at that moment. And this is important because Bourdieu mentioned that this kind of durable way of standing, speaking, bodily hexes, and Appiah mentioned this kind of set of dispositions to respond more or less spontaneously. So you don't really realize sometimes that you are doing so, but still is part of your daily habitus, your routine, and so on. In that sense, the bodily hexes also include the modes of speech, intellectual style, the distinctive accent that reflects your social identity, and so on. And this is very clear that, if, for example, in the British society, like in 3 centuries before, the English accent, which had this connotation to refer to the upper classes, it was used to distance themselves from the people. I mean, if you watch, for instance, Jane Austen, the TV show that was released, I think, in 1999, the TV series, even the movie a bit later can be used as an example. You see how the people from the aristocracy, they have a particular accent, which was used to separate themselves from the plebeians. And this has been kind of expand to our current times. In that sense, as Appiah says, quote, our identity shapes our habitus unconsciously, end quote. This is fundamental to understand this idea of culture, identity, how the people in our surroundings also shape our consciousness, same as we do of them. The other day was with my friends, friends from my life, and a person who was coming to meet the group for, I think, second or third time. She say, "Oh, you guys have similar gestures when you speak, use similar words and so on." And I reply like, "Yes, because we have been friends for many years, decades even, and henceforth we have been able to influence ourselves during that time." And this is something that is inevitable and is part of our upbringing in different societies. So, finishing with this episode of classification, I will go to the chapter 2 of the book, which is creed. And this is one in which Appiah analyzed the religion, how religion he points that is a combination between belief, practice, and the community. He gives here a kind of controversial argument, expressing that Hinduism was created by British colonials to combat the religious diversity in India and to establish a single entity in the 19th century. According to Appiah, this is because the British colonizers encountered a pagan profession of cults and gods and wanted to emerge everything in one kind of creed in order to subjugate the population. Remember that Britain went to India in the 18th century. They used this tactic of divide to win, as in ancient Rome it was proclaimed by Caesar, and in that sense they seek alliance with the kind of entrepreneurs, leaders of different groups in India, because there were different cults and so on. And they were there for 200 years. They faced a rebellion later on. And in order to kind of establish their dominion, not just structurally creating the colony, but also ideologically to establish their hegemony there, according to Appiah, they form religion, because religion, same as nation and other currents, is very important in order to form an homogeneous mass. And in that sense, for Appiah is precisely that the modern concept of religion gained currency in the 19th century, because it could be combined with the modern advance of technologies, like the creation of networks, the trains, the different roads in order to spread the news more widely. Also the newspapers, it was fundamental. The building of many churches or different other religious buildings and so on, in order to create a whole community in which, let's say that you are in a town and everybody's reading the same newspaper. Even though you don't read that newspaper, you will know what is happening around. And even if you decide to read another newspaper, perhaps people will see you with concern, with disdain. They may not trust you. And at the end, you will be forced to kind of read the newspaper. Or another easy example about the social condition in your surroundings, how, let's say you are living in a town and all your friends are getting married. You are a person who are single, and perhaps you are being forced to get into a couple, not just in a kind of explicit way, like, oh look, we feel pity for you, you are alone, you are lonely, so you need to find somebody for yourself, but rather it will be in a more subtle way, like, oh, we are getting married now, we are going to have son, what about you? And you may feel the pressure of the people. Perhaps it can happen that they are very nice with you and they support you, and even in doing so, you will feel a same, because you are looking at your size, and you may have a existential crisis and so on. It is not casualty that after the Second World War, there was this kind of rural migration in almost every country in Europe, like Germany, France, Italy, and so on. But even during the Second World War, in the colonies, for instance, in Africa and Asia, people were forced to go to the cities to be part in the creation of art, the production of weapons, to the exercise of the war. And after that, the people encountered different communities, and they felt that the life in the city were totally different to the rural area in which every people knew each other. But now in city, many of them found the freedom which they were not able to or willing to refuse anymore. So in that sense, obviously you see how in the big cities with the different communities, people coming from different areas of different countries or from the same country but different cities, these ideas are less established. The idea of conditioning yourself to get married, to form a family, kind of traditional Christian values are not so typically so. And in that sense, Appiah comes with this idea of going against scriptural determinism, in that sense, how this language can be interpreted in many ways, like reading the Quran, the Bible, the Talmud, and so on. This is interesting because it's part of the modern society, the secular humanism, in which people gives more importance to the human rather than a divine God. Henceforth, it doesn't mean that they cannot read these scriptural sacred scriptures, but rather that they will interpret them in different ways. So they will find that the metaphorical approach of the writings and so on, rather than to follow an idea in a literal way, as could happen in the past when the priest was in the church and was reading the Bible, or was in the mosque reading the Quran and so on. In that sense, and going back to Catholicism, Appiah points how religion has obviously changed the way that we relate ourselves in societies. And he gives an example, which is homosexuality, how this idea of having relation with people from the same sex was widely accepted in Greece and Rome, but it was rejected once Christianity became the hegemonic culture, ideology, political structure, and so on. So in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, apparently there was no problem for being an homosexual, even though those societies were thousands of years ago, and yet Catholicism abolished this practice. And we have the case that even nowadays, there are many countries in which homosexuality is persecuted. But also in kind of the Western world, how Thatcher implemented a legislation to punish homosexuality. In 1950s, Alan Turing, who became a hero in the Second World War, for create the machine in order to decipher the message of the Nazis. Obviously, the movie, The Imitation Game with Benedict Cumberbatch, explains that history, and how this person was given medications to, quote, cure homosexuality, end quote, and at the end this person died. So yeah, that was the way that the British thanks Alan Turing for his great efforts in the Second World War, just killing him a decade later. In that sense, Appiah point to the hostility to sex between men and between women that was created by the Christianity, and unfortunately have a reach nowadays. Obviously, he refers to Christianity, but Catholicism is not the only xenophobe, misogynist religion in the world, or permeated with machismo. All the religions are very conservative in that way. Conservative, but in the sense that religion has imposed this term, because again, in the ancient Rome and ancient Greece, there was homosexuality, but not in the Islam, in Christian Catholicism, Protestantism, Judaism, Hinduism, and so on. Even Buddhism, which is, in my opinion, the religion who try to engage more with all the sentience in nature, trying to establish a system of harmony between nature, the planet, and its beings, still have some kind of temples in places like Thailand or other areas of Asia, in which only the men are allowed to enter. And a friend who was in Thailand told me that this was because, according to the slogan that they could read in the temple, because the women have the menstruation, this could kind of destroy the harmony or the peaceful way in which Buddhism interpret the nature and so on. And Yuval Noah Harari points how in Israel, the Muslims, the Jews, and the Christians, they only agreed in something one day of the year, and this is precisely the day of the Pride, because all of them are against that. So, how religion are legitimizing itself in order to explain how homosexuality and other ideas that they consider subversive must be eliminated. And to finish the episode about Appiah, last thing I wanted to speak about the chapter 3, which is called Country. The country, same as the creed, is something which is an idea very... we had a lot of force in order to join a community. This was being seen during the wars. Also, how the elites pay the newspapers in order to indoctrinate the masses in the idea that going to the war was something just, that how the others were the enemies, and so on. This has a very importance in the construction of Europe during the Crusades against the Muslim, but also in the First World War, how the British, the French, the United States, the Germans, they proclaimed how their countries were the most significant in the world and their cause was just. This is also explored in Walter Lippmann, on public opinions book. I have done some episodes about him. They are very important, how this importance of the power, the state, the newspapers, and so on, in order to create a new intellectual paradigm to push society to a different way. In that sense, Lippmann points how it was curious that there was an island during 1914 in which there were French, English, and German people living there. The war had already started, but because the news came to the island like some weeks later, those people were still living in peace, even though that their compatriots in Europe were killing each other. And the news of that reached like weeks later. And same happened at the end of the war, when the armistice between the Germans, French, and British have been signed. And because the news came to the front like some days later, there were still people killing each other, even though in theory there was already peace. So this importance of the media to determine the reality which we are living. And this is something that Walter Lippmann, again, with the idea of the manufacturing concept that also Noam Chomsky has studied widely, explores in his all works, like the problems of philosophy, problems of politics, or on public opinion. So going back to Appiah, he refers to the country, speaks about Mazzini and nationalism. Mazzini is one of the intellectuals of the idea of nationalism. He participated in the revolutions in the 19th century in Italy. Probably he was the most important figure about nationalism, and in fact Woodrow Wilson, the president of the United States, during the First World War, I think it was just at the end of the First World War, he came to Italy to commemorate Mazzini, because there was a statue in, I don't remember in which city it was in Italy, but praising his ideals of how protecting one country, it must be fundamental. In that sense, for the nationalism of Mazzini, it is, according to Appiah, the prayer to multiply your forces. So from individual to the nation, you want to feel part of something greater than yourself, and the nation, in that way, it is one of the perfect currents to do so, because you see how are your neighbors are raising the banner in the street, how the flags are covering, let's say, the square of Parliament, people signing the national anthem all together, people reading the same newspaper, engaging in conversation, analyzing how is going the war. This is the kind of creation of pseudo environment that, again, Lippmann philosophizes about that, how we are based in a reality that has been written by us, by the media. But this is important. I mean, if we want to know what is happening outside ourselves, like the war in Ukraine, or the war in Yemen, the attacks of Israel against Palestine, and some the reality in Latin America, we need to read media, because the world is so vast, and if we want to try to get informed, we will we need to be able to stay in this pseudo environment in which something which we cannot see, but we need to believe. Lippmann says that the important for here is to read as much newspaper as possible, or at least to create some independent media which try to explain the reality in a kind of more objective way, if this is possible, but at least newspapers who are not subjected to the finance of capitalists or the state, because obviously they will favor those kind of interests. In that sense, going back to the book, he points how Hegel, the German philosopher, explained that a people without state formation has no real history. In that sense, in the system of people, the substantial purpose is to be a state and to maintain itself as such. Hegel had this theory that history was determined until the end of history, which was the reach of the idea with capital A. And the idea was the state. The state was like the final approach. Hegel was very conservative in this thought, and it's interesting because Marx and Engels took Hegel's idea of the dialectical materialism, but they did not point that the state was the final aspect of history, but rather was communism, the kind of process in which the state was to be crushed after the working class took the power, and then in a society without a state, only communism could be reached. So, for Appiah, the idea of the country took a great meaning, not just after the French Revolution, when the people in Paris, after the fall of the Bastille and after the March on Versailles in October, they were able to create the first modern nation in Europe, which was France. But also 1 century later, how from the Berlin Conference in 1884-1885, which was called the Scramble of Africa, in which the colonial powers divide the continent among themselves, and you see how in that time Africa was colonized by the Dutch, by the Belgians, by England, France, or Germany, and so on, Spain, and how these boundaries were moving after through the colonization in the process that happened like 50, 60 years later. In that sense, for Appiah, the idea to create much a state with a nation, because a state for him is like the geographical barriers, and the nation is the kind of idea that the identity that people have built by themselves with the help of different institutions. And sometimes people living in a state, they are not considered part of it because they are from different nations. This was very well explained after the First World War, when the empires collapsed and you had how in Prussia or in the Ottoman Empire there were many nationalities living with the same empire, and once the empire disintegrated itself and a lot of states were created, people were forced to leave because, let's say, they were Slavic people living in Austria, or they were like Hungarians people living in Poland and so on, and they were forced to move because suddenly their kind of area where they have been living for their whole life, it was not so, because somebody established that this was not their state anymore, and being a members of different nations, they were forced to move. In that sense, Appiah says that there are 3 ways to match a state with a nation, which is annihilating the people, which is like things that Hitler did, for example, the thing that with the Jewish people, how the English people did in Kenya against the Africans living there, exterminating, or the French in Algeria, the Spanish in South America, and so on, like making these people disappear. The other is expelling people from the territory. This is what Israel is doing in Palestine right now, pushing people and destroying their houses and so on, and leaving them wherever they go, and they don't really care that much, the people who are expelling each other. And also happened during the First World War, in the interwar period, how the refugees were being pushed from different countries, nobody accepted them, and so on. Or assimilation, which is basically forcing people to become part of the state. In that sense, the modern nationalism, according to Appiah, it was part of the idea of Romanticism born in Germany as a reaction against the Enlightenment. In that sense, it was a kind of dichotomy between nature versus industry, emotions versus rationalization, and so on, and how Romanticism was a celebration of people, a folk tradition, and we have in German philosophy the term of Volksgeist, which means the soul of the spirit of the folk. And just to finish the episode, how the role of literature is very important in the writings of Shakespeare, Homero, James Joyce, and so on. Or different, you can think about many different authors in the history of literature. And just to finish with the episode of Appiah, mentioning how he gives importance to the identity, how identity is something that you cannot put upon yourself, neither people can put upon you, but it's a kind of combination between a construction of society, your upbringing, the traditions, the customs in different areas where you live. If you travel around and live in another society, once you come back to your homeland, you will find the difference more openly and see how the culture operates in different areas of the world, even though nowadays seems that the planet is more homogeneous than before through social media, the interconnection of networks, but still there are different particularities that are difficult to grasp. But if you look attentively at what is happening around you, the way that people have to behave themselves, even yourself, you don't behave the same way when you are maybe, let's say, in a kind of formal meeting in your work, or in a dinner with your family, or when you go with your friends, or being yourself among nature, when you go, let's say, to the mountain and so on. How yourself change depending the situation, and how the outside world condition in the way that you behave around.